Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a political podcast that this week is discussing the Indonesian general elections, and I don't know enough about Indonesian politics to make a joke, so just telling you what it is. It's a bit of a change of pace, I know, but this is going to be a bit of a different episode. And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm pretty good. As we was talking about before we started recording, I'm at friends for Easter. There's going to be drinking, merriment, video games. I'm running a fairly horrific one shot of D&D. I hope. Well, I mean, I kind of don't want them to survive. We'll see what happens. And how's your weekend been, Rob? I hear you went to the cricket.
Yeah, I went to the cricket. I saw Somerset thrash Kent, and then I've come home, relaxed, and yeah, I didn't have any breakfast this morning, so I just found a souffle in the fridge and ate it, because that's the most middle-class thing you can do. So, yeah, living the dream here, man.
And we're joined today by two guests, all the way from Indonesia. So you will have heard their dulcet tones before. We have Ev on the line. How are you, Ev?
I'm well. We're at the house arguing about when the heck we're supposed to be going to church this weekend. We've had 4 different discussions, and it's only just decided we're going on Sunday after I told them I was recording a podcast so we couldn't go to the Saturday evening service. So that was a bit of a small stink, but we're been a nice quiet weekend. I'm glad for it.
And we're also joined by Daniel. Can you say hi to the listeners? We've not spoken before, so yeah. It's nice to have you on. Thank you for joining us and helping. So Ev's already given us some background, but it's nice to have you here to give us some more details on what's happened.
All right, I'm glad to be here.
Excellent. So yeah, we're kind of going to let the two of you take the lead on this, I suppose, because it's your politics. We don't know a massive amount about it. I know that Rob knows a bit about the alternative voting system you use, but I think, should we just go on with... So previously we discussed what was happening in the lead up to the general elections. You've now had the general elections. Has it turned out as you expected? It's probably a good place to start.
Pretty much. I believe I mentioned to you in passing that Joko Widodo, the incumbent, was leading in the polls at the time we recorded the previous episode, and by every account except that of the loser, he has won.
Yeah,
that is a whole thing, but every poll that I found, at least it's summarized on the Wikipedia page, so you can find it there. He's won by at least, in the unofficial quick count, which I can ask Dan to explain quick counts and the vote systems and all of that in a moment. He's won by 8 points at minimum, 54 to 46 at the minimum, and unfortunately, Prabowo's team has, I guess, to keep his supporters happy, has for some odd reason declared that he won by 62 to 38, which is something along the margins of like 25 million votes at an estimate.
Yeah, it's a massive advantage, and a lot of people on social media and in the news have just been sort of, well, in the media, they're all sort of respective and like, where's the data and everything, but on social media, it's more just memes and jokes about like, he doesn't know how to count and other more unsavory things.
Yeah, I mean, that's some impressive vote stuffing, if you could make it go that far that way. I think as an outside observer, it doesn't seem surprising. The vote difference is roughly what it was in your previous general election, right? So it's about... It's a similar kind of lead between the same candidates, essentially. I know that they had different running mates before, but essentially the same vote difference. So it doesn't seem untoward as an outsider. So as long as you feel it's above board as well, that's good, I think. So before we were kind of in the lead up to these elections, was there anything interesting that happened in the lead up? Is it like if the vote has gone vaguely the way we were expecting? Was there any upset along the way, or did it just was the campaign from when we last spoke essentially fairly above board as well?
I don't know if I can say that for sure. I think it's not a lack of disturbing events. It's just, and I use disturbing not in like the scary sense, in just more of like disruption sense. But there hasn't been a lot of disruption, so to say. It's just, I think at the same time there's the two coalitions, and the people have already been pretty dead set on like who they're gonna pick. So not a lot, despite a lot of things happening or not happening, they just seem to be already chosen their candidate since at least a month ago.
Right. So there's no last minute upset essentially.
There has been, well, some people have tried, obviously. I think this is a very odd thing. This is also a very, very new thing. So in on YouTube there has been this sort of documentary. It's very famous now. I think it's called Sexy Killers. It's a very odd title. It's about the coal industry. I don't know why they name it Sexy Killers, but it's basically sort of an expose on the sort of like the shady things that happen in the Indonesian coal industries. And they also managed to name basically key persons in the whole fiasco. And both the opposition and the incumbent have people that were openly named. And I think that contributed to the whole people who aren't going to vote. So just sort of the like the silent majority there chose to remain silent as a form of a protest. In Indonesia, the movement is called Golput, which is Golongan Putih, which means the I don't know, the white few, something along those lines, basically.
Basically going neither one way nor the other. And despite that, I think the turnout was something along the lines of like 80%. So it was still pretty decent considering we had 190 million voters, which is a larger vote block than most countries, populations, including the UK.
By a significant margin. It's like 3 UKs going out to vote.
So considering that many people getting there, and we have a country that, and I wanted to talk to Dan about this again. We had a discussion off the mic before about this. Why we have a history and a reputation where we're very easily corruptible in our politics, that we can still trust that even the unofficial results are fairly trustworthy, despite what some specific parties might say, and how seriously you said that the election commission just takes its job because they know that any stink is going to basically
ruin
screw it all up.
Their reputation. I think they all recognize that it is a very, very delicate democracy that they're handling. So I think in the last episode, Evan did discuss that we did go through a very ominously named New Order era where we were so basically the general, one of the leading generals in the War for Independence, became president and ruled for 28 years and was very, very harsh on both the opposition and any sort of political dissent in the public sector. So we have, and not to mention, he also was very into crony capitalism. So if you were a member of his family or one of his old, like, I don't know, bunkmates in the military or like whatever they're called, you almost could guarantee yourself either a business position or a governmental position in one of the ministries or head of one of the ministries. So it was very, people were very, very disillusioned about the government. At least a large portion of the people are, while the other large portion that remained very, very loyal to Suharto is still championing to this day. We're like, oh, it was a lot better back then. We had no inflation, and we had like better public service, and like, let's, go back to a military dictatorship. They don't say that out loud, but that's what they're implying, which is kind of scary. So there's a lot of distrust going around, and I think the government does a very poor job of trying to earn back that trust. It just sort of be like, people are complaining, but they just sort of stay silent. They don't exactly do very well in trying to like socialize all the different steps in reformation that they're trying to do. And part of that is to blame because they aren't motivated to, but also the other half of the blame can be said because we don't have a very strong like media infrastructure or educational infrastructure to sort of, establish a line of communication between the people who are in power and, the people who are citizens of the country.
Right. Yeah. So the way I've heard this kind of described, I suppose, for the English listener, because I've been listening to The Economist has like a short 20-minute news thing they do each day, and they try and cover the biggest story. And so the election was the biggest story the other day. That they were kind of saying, essentially, you've correct me on the actual timeline here, but you've had democracy for 20 years since that dictatorship ended. Is that correct?
Yeah, 20 years. Last year was the 20th anniversary. We're going on 21 this year. So 98 was when we overthrew the ruler.
Yeah. So it's a very, very interesting view into what is a very new democracy and how, because I think the general narrative that's sold, especially in maybe the American media and also to an extent in the UK media, is that democracy is a great thing and always trumps what came before it. But you don't really see this kind of analysis, at least not on the news, about how that can be fragile following a change of regime and moving to democracy. And so it's very interesting to hear how people are still suspicious of it, that you have people who are saying, oh, well, the old ways were better. And you always get those people, as we've been seeing with the various referendums in the UK recently. It's interesting to see that. Going into the actual voting system and stuff like that, you mentioned a slightly surprising thing to me, Ev, last week about how you actually do your votes, which I think might be quite interesting to explain to the listeners.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so we don't have any form of electronic voting. We distrust that as well. What you have instead is you go take a paper ballot, then there's a spike at the ballot box, and you stab straight through the paper ballot once, through like the pictures of the candidates, or for in this case, because the legislative list was like very long, there's like 80 candidates of ballot or so through the next to the name, and you can invalidate it by just spiking multiple places, or there was a couple of cases where somebody would spike through the eyes of every candidate.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Just to spite the candidates. Yeah.
Yeah. But I find it, and then you fold it back up, and like you can't see where the holes are because it's folded so neatly that like the front and the back don't show anything, and it's one hole in like a sheet of paper that's like 6 folds deep. But
the ballot, I have to say, the ballot is about the size of, if you use this kind of thing in the UK, it's about like the size of an A2 paper, I think, or an A1.
Oh,
so
wow.
It's large.
Okay, that's huge.
It's the size of it's just the size of a movie poster.
And then you fold it up, and it's the size of like a phone.
Can I ask a practical question then? So with so many choices, how can you make are you genuinely making an informed decision, do you think? Or is it just voting on party lines? Because I just think if I had that, I don't know if I'd have the knowledge about every single candidate to make a fully informed decision, even though you've got that choice. How do you go about like casting your vote and voting for all those people at the same time?
Anecdotally, once you get past about 5 candidates, nobody has a clue what they're doing. There's 16 parties.
Very true. We tend to vote on party lines. I think that's what the discussion me and my family had right before we went to the poll. So it was the night before we were going to like the ballot boxes, and we were all like, I know some families would share on like their family chat groups just sort of a picture of the ballot box and sort of an X over the candidates you can't vote, and a red star next to the candidate that like, oh, this is recommended by our family, which is very odd. But it is very difficult to make an informed choice. I tried to make an informed choice. I gave up after about, I think it was 20 or so candidates. I just couldn't keep track. There were so many, and I ended up voting on party lines. But there is, you can vote on party, basically the it's not easy to vote on party either, because I think there are like 33 parties, each with their own history and context and reputation. So it's still difficult, but just party lines could be easier.
And then there's only 16 in most of the provinces. Only 16 of the parties made it onto the ballot at all. And I think the results of the legislative elections, because we didn't cover that before when I was talking about the results, is that there were 10 parties in the lower house. The upper house, nobody really cares much about. They don't have as much power. You can talk about that later. And nobody really cares about the regional councils either, except the per region, obviously. But like, there's 10 parties in the legislature, and 16 were trying to get in. 4 new parties, and then 2 that sued when they didn't meet the requirements or something. Only 9 of them, and only 9 of the 10 that were in the legislature before from the previous election made it back in, because nobody, none of the new parties, neither of the 2 that challenged the court to let us into the ballot had nearly enough support. That was part of the problem that they were excluded in the first place. And then one of the parties had a problem where Partai Hanura had a corruption scandal basically blow up just before the election, I think, and it tanked their popularity enough that they did worse than some of the new parties, which is pretty bad. But yeah, paper ballots, stab it through, put it in the box to be counted, and then the way the quick count works is that they at the polling stations they open the boxes and start counting the votes, and then they put the ballots back, not back in the boxes or either back into special bags, but like they counted, open each ballot up one by one. It takes hours. I think I was sat. They started counting at like 2 p.m. at my polling station, and we're still counting when I finally left at like 5:30 because of the number of it's 200 ballots per, and 4 elections in my district and 5 in other places.
So I was lucky enough to actually visit and speak with the chairman of the election commission, and he explained it to me that basically the moment the polling stations close at about 1 or 1:30, and they would just count basically for 24 hours straight. The time limit is midday the day after, and under certain special conditions they would extend it to the next they'd give an additional half day or 12-hour extension for the quick count.
So what's the difference between the quick count and the full count?
The full count, all the ballots get sent from every corner of the country, which is like several thousand kilometers wide, to the capital city here in Jakarta, and then they get counted by the election body, and that can take weeks.
Right, okay. So we're still in that period right now, waiting for the official result.
I believe this will go on until May, middle of May, I believe.
That's the deadline. They get 4 weeks to do all the counting, and then the legal challenges start like May the 23rd for anybody who wants to go, this is wrong, we cheated, and we can maybe prove it, possibly.
It is the reason they do that to sort of reduce the chance of corruption, so you get the quick counts from the regions, and then they're centrally confirmed, essentially, by the independent governing body, I assume. Yeah.
Yes. I think this is also the step of the process where the KPU, or the Election Commission, that's what it's called in Indonesian, they would also receive watchdog organizations and also election, what are they called? They're just transparency officials from UN and Human Rights Watch. I think there's like half a dozen organizations that internationally sent to survey these to make sure that nothing is that there is no or as little foul play as possible,
or tampering, or ballot stuffing on the order of millions of votes that clearly the other candidate won.
It's fine. I mean, we've seen these kind of claims in the Western media as well, where people say, "Oh, like with the whole thing with Trump and the electoral college, etc. You know, but people will talk about stuff like that. But it's quite bold to say that you've got that many million votes counted the wrong way. Sorry, Rob, you were about to say something.
No, I was just going to ask, it's a very general question, but do you think that helps restore people's faith in democracy in Indonesia? Or is it still something that's regularly questioned and distrusted?
It has a mixed effect, because it's very difficult to sort of guess what the people is thinking when the people involves about 260 million people over thousands and thousands of kilometers, each of them with different concerns. So I can't say for sure there, but people who are in touch with the politics, people who care, who will read the news and sort of have a stake in the political ongoings of our country, do care. But at the same time, there is also a large fraction of I can't say how much for sure, but there is a large fraction of the people who they don't care, or some of them don't care, but some of them also just don't know what to listen to or who to trust. So they just sort of, they don't care how the election is done. It's just, they've made their choice and they just go on with their lives. They don't really feel the impact of, the various, effort that the election commission does, or, the praise or, the criticism of the international community in general. They're just sort of locked into their local bubble where, like, oh, I go to vote for this guy because he looks nice, or my family member suggested me to vote for candidate A, so I voted for him, and then I'll just go on with the rest of my life. So
or
he's
more
quite polarizing.
Or he's more clearly Muslim, and I empathize with that. And again, religion's a big part of the electorate, because 80% of you say 250. I thought it was, or 260. I thought it was 280 million people by now. But 80% of the population, I don't know how much of that is the electorate, is Muslim. And so when there was an element of, in the campaigning, of, I am definitely a pious Muslim, don't start slandering me that I'm not, and are you sure this guy is? And that sort of back and forth. Like, I mentioned that a large part of the reason that, Joko Widodo, picked and is a high-ranking Muslim cleric as his vice president was the optics of that choice. Especially considering Prabowo's pick for vice president was kind of out of nowhere, and I don't know how much actual political sense it made. Why did he pick Sandi, by the way? To ask you.
So I think the biggest ongoing rumor is just that he is the money. So if you don't know, the vice president of the opposition party, Sandiaga Uno, before he became the vice governor for the special region of Jakarta, he was a prominent businessman. He has, I think, millions and millions of dollars to his name in various businesses. So I think the strongest narrative out there is just that the campaign needed extra money, and I believe there was an article on a newspaper, I have to find it, but that he contributed a large fraction, I think it was more than 50% of all campaign funds came from him, just because he was the money. And he is filthy rich, I suppose, by the definition of most people who live in this country.
So if you donate to the Unparliamentary Language Patreon, you too can become a vice presidential candidate.
So I know we did discuss this we gave a general overview of this in the other episode, the bonus episode, but to kind of put it into our terms, so the current party that has maintained, that's Joko. Again, apologies for any murdering of the words that are going to come out of my mouth. So Jokowi was they're centre left, that party, right? Is that correct? They're not. They're like because that's what's interesting about them having the Muslim cleric, and then having, like, the party is seen as a more left party, but also they've been, you mentioned previously, like, for example, they're that they don't have a necessarily great policy on homophobic things and so on, for example. So they're supposed to be left, but there might be some concerns there. Is that correct, or am I misconstruing that?
So here's the thing. To answer this question, I'm going to have to go into this article, which I think I can just send to the chat. It's useful, and it's based on a research conducted by the Australian National University on basically the parliament. The members of the parliament would take a test, a survey that was to sort of determine where they stood on economic measures, foreign policy, and basically the different policy branches of the government. So, and in about almost all of them, where they would fall in the middle of the political spectrum, both in like economic, like conservative versus progressive. They were all sort of straight down in the middle. So there's just not a lot of heterogeneity in like where they stand in, their stance on on economic policies and the such. However, the only place where they did found a drastic difference was how does the party and the party members feel about the religion of Islam, and then that's where you see a massive differentiation between the parties that would prefer to remain, I guess you can say, like, constitutional, so they remains true to the 1945 constitution that was made in at the birth of our country. And then there's also the parties that skewed very far to the conservative Muslim base, and they would say that no, our country needs to make more laws that are in accordance to the Quran and Sharia law than to the 1945 constitution and the Pancasila. The Pancasila is sort of it's like the guiding principles of our country. It's like 5 guiding principles, and let me try to find them, but they're basically they're very famous. Every student, every person in Indonesia knows what the Pancasila is, and it used to stand sort of for both how do I say it? It's basically, it advocates that every person has a right to economic justice and representation in government, and also that every religion has sort of an equal stance. And despite the fact that we are many different peoples, many different religions, we shall stay as one, and we shall continue to have, that sort of like tolerant mindset towards like having a discourse and discussion between different people instead of just shunning the other people out. And that's, I think, the most controversial thing you will see up until late is that a lot of people, there is I want to say a conservative wing in the government that's just trying to say, like, maybe the Pancasila, maybe our constitution didn't work so well in the last 70 years. Maybe we need to start moving more towards, adopting more conservative Muslim laws and policies.
Right, okay. So when you say it's a constitution, is it constitution as in the US Constitution? It is essentially law that from which other laws are formed, or is it more like the UK Constitution, where it's kind of a series of guidelines that people follow and can interpret as they like? I mean, not that people don't try and interpret the US Constitution either, but I mean that's more embedded in their legal system than ours is.
We definitely wrote it down, and we've amended it multiple times, and it's there for everyone to see. So I think in the sense that it's there in writing for anybody to look up, it's more like the U.S. Constitution. I don't know if people argue about it in the same way that people do the U.S. Constitution. Because the five Panchasila, I got an English translation here, is one, belief in the one and only God, which does get a little bit of argument, because if you have a one and only God, does that include atheism and polytheism? But that's a different issue. 2, a just and civilized humanity. 3, a unified Indonesia, which was important because you've got like several hundred ethnic groups and they all got differences, and we want to be a unified Indonesia, and it was also why we got in trouble with Malaysia, because we thought East Malaysia, what is now East Malaysia, was part of a unified Indonesia for our ideological reasons. It did. British commandos got involved, and so we got.
Oh, that's always a good sign. Yeah.
4, democracy led by the wisdom of the representatives of the people. How wise the representatives of the people are heavily debated. And
I mean, that doesn't specify that they have to be wise, merely that they use their wisdom, and their wisdom score could be 2 for all we know.
Yeah, the representative wing of our government is, I think, is when they took a poll a couple of years back, could be in 2016, 2017, 2018, I'm not sure, but it is the most disreputable branch of the government. People's trust in the presidency and various ministers were sort of in the middle, high to middle, and then when you start talking about like the DPR, which is our parliament, it just fell through the floor. I think it was like 20% or lower. Maybe it's like low 20s. Like their approval rate was just horrible, and you can sort of see why.
Oh, before we move on, if I say 4 of the 5 Panchasila, people are gonna get mad at me. Number 5 is social justice for all Indonesians. Sorry, go on.
Okay, yes, no, that's good. Good to have it complete. So we've talked about the general election, and you mentioned the legislative election when we were talking earlier. Is that more interesting to look into? Because so in the UK, we have the system whereby you vote for all your local MPs, and then that's how you work out which party wins and therefore which prime minister we get. And then we also have local elections for like local councils. So these legislative elections are presumably comparable to that, so that you're voting in mayors, things like that. Yes.
Yeah. It's usually quite in the UK. It's quite a lot fewer candidates, because I think I remember the John Oliver segment of like Maidenhead, where there was Lord Buckethead and Her Right Honourable Theresa May in the same district. There was only like 5 other candidates. Yeah, we have way more candidates, so like you can vote along party lines very quickly because you only have like 1 candidate per party. That's how many they can field, or the number of people they have to field. We have registered the vote. That was 3 days ago. You're late. Lord, what was I saying? Okay, the thing is that you can register like up to 8 candidates per party per district or something like that. I don't remember.
I think it depends on the size of the constituency. I think in my district they had, I was selecting between 20 to 30 different candidates for my council, for my councilman or councilperson position, basically.
Yeah.
It got really confusing.
So that's 30 people running for one position.
Yes.
So it's not multiple seats within the council. Wait, sorry. So I'm just trying to get my head around that. So when we have council elections, we will vote for. So the council will be for, say, a city, and we'll vote in our very small like districts for councillors, and then they will go in, and in a similar way to how our general government works, then the number of councillors from each party basically works out which party controls the local council. So you end up with Tory councils, Labour councils. So you have 30 candidates running for your individual councillor, who then goes into the council, which is made up of other councillors. Is that correct?
I believe so. It's a little bit, it's a little bit of a mess. So
that's just a lot. We know from what we've seen with Brexit and the European elections, people aren't good when there's a lot of options on the table. They want like 2 or 3 options.
In my district, my mother, when she sent me the thing for the local, for the upper house, there were like 30 candidates, and she just said, "This is the incumbent. He's done a good job. Just pick him." I'm like, "What do we know of the other ones?" Nothing. Just pick, just pick that guy. It's fine. And then pick these two parties for the regional council and the lower house. I'm saying lower house and upper house because the lower house is DPR, the upper house is DPD, and then the regional council is DPRD, which is going to get very confusing very quickly.
I was talking about this with my housemates actually because I saw your post about that the other day, and we were joking. It's like the People's Liberation Front, the Liberation Front of the People of Judea, and all of that from Life of Brian, where they're all basically the same name. At least that's how it looks to us with those acronyms.
And wait until we. I want to at some point also discuss the Corruption Commission because that's a fun topic. But that's the KPK, and the Election Commission is the KPU, which is great. We have very few differentiators. So the DPRD is just a sort of gigantic body that's, I think the entire point is like to represent each region. But why do you remember why we only have like one per province or whatever it is, or one per district? Then
Do you mean like the council representative or what?
The DPRD.
Oh, I don't believe it is just one. So the reason, I'm trying to remember the reason. It's not coming to me right now, but I believe it has something to do with just how many provinces we have. It just contributes to there. But the historical and original reason is I can't summon that at the moment.
Would the reason? Sorry, this. I know nothing of your politics, but I only know of like pure politics decisions and sort of world building. So I'll try and put in that perspective. My understanding would be that, I mean, Indonesia is made up of a lot of different cultures and a lot of different like physical islands, right? Like literal places that I imagine have quite a very strong local identity. Would that be correct? So if you've got a big sort of democracy that has to balance all of that, then the way most states tend to do it is they say, right, we have a big parliament that allows us to get the general idea of what all the populace are thinking. However, at a very local and regional level, that's when we give sort of just one person to really represent that state and push those local issues. Would that make sense within the context of Indonesian politics and how it's designed to work?
Yeah, that would. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
This would serve as a pretty interesting transition into the Corruption Commission. But before we enter there, I believe that what you said previously, Evan, about like, families recommending like, oh, vote for this party. I believe that one serious issue during this election was that some parties would nominate candidates who have previously been indicted or convicted of committing corruption. So that was very interesting.
I imagine it cleared the field a little bit.
It did. Because I think out of the 16 parties you mentioned, I think 9 of them have candidates who were already like convicted or indicted for corruption. So out of all of the major parties who like rule the majority of the parliament right now, I think there are like 4 major parties, and only one of them does not have candidates who have been like convicted of corruption and is running again. So I think that was a big thing for me personally and also my family, in which we were like, there are too many parties, we can't decide, let's decide by party lines. And when you look at the party, there's a lot of history that's very, very difficult to sort of decipher and go into all of it. You can't do the research. And so at least I personally just ended up picking the party that had that had said no to convicted corruptors who were like, hey, can I run again? I mean, like, I have a horrible, horrible reputation and a horrible, horrible track record, but I'll be nice this time. Can I come in again? And we were like, no. And all the other parties were like, yeah, sure, why not? We don't care.
So how does that tie into you mentioned a corruption commission. If you've got people who are corrupt, just being able to switch party and run again, is that essentially not working? Is that the problem?
Yeah, so the Corruption Commission in our country is, I think, when I mentioned previously, when the people were polled, what's the most trustworthy body within the government? I think the Corruption Commission was the number one. They ranked highest at about 80 or 90% approval rates, and that comes at a great cost. I think it is. Personally, I believe it's one of the greatest institutions we have in our country. I fall in with those who believe that it is great, and it's the government body that works the most. So the way they do it, I believe, is that they sort of investigate claims of corruption, and then so it works differently from other corruption bodies around the world. That's what they said, which is they're one of the only bodies that both does the investigation and the prosecution. So it's not like in the United States where the investigation can be done by the FBI or the police, and then the case is submitted to the Department of Justice. This is different, where it's all handled under one body. And one of the reasons why they do that, I believe, is because they don't trust anyone else. They just they're worried that if they hand off the case to other bodies of the government, that more money is going to change hands, and then the case is never going to see the light of day. And I believe that a lot of people in the government are also primarily in the regional and the local, regional, and also parliamentary levels. A lot of people do not like the Corruption Commission, and so they've done a lot of things to sort of declaw the organization and take away its power. One of them would be by sort of limiting their budget as much as they can. They would do tons and tons of audits per year just so that they could slow down the process. If I can choose one anecdote, one of them is that because they have to take the people who are under investigation to safe houses, for security reasons, and also to place certain important documents and particular investigators into certain safe houses, because there are a lot of security issues and life threats. They have a lot of safe houses, and one anecdote was that one of the commissions of the parliament that was under investigation said that this is a good time to have an audit of the Corruption Commission, just sort of to slow down, but also to sort of try to get some information to get ahead of the investigation, which should be illegal, but they also wield a lot of power. And what they did was they were like, "Oh, we're here to audit. Can you show us your safe houses so that we can audit to make sure you're not spending the money unwisely?" And the Corruption Commission, that defies the definition of a safe house. We're supposed to be the only people who know where these safe houses were. But then the Corruption Commission insisted and insisted and insisted to the point where they were like, "Fine, we're going to show you the safe house, but we're going to blindfold you and basically deafen your ears until you arrive at the location, and we will show you only the inside of the building, and then you can see it, and then we are going to blindfold you and deafen you and then bring you back out." And that's the amount of the lengths at which we go to try the back and forth between the government and the Corruption Commission that's trying to do its job.
So the Corruption Commission presumably has some kind of mandate from the government itself. So that's the thing they're trying to whittle away at, as well as reducing funding, or is it a political hot potato essentially to try and reduce its official power, and so they're just trying to undermine it in other ways? So I believe one of the things they try to do is also actually I can't remember at the moment, but other than reducing budget, they try to put in amendments to the original law that was passed, I think in 2013, that officially gave the corruption its power. They tried to say that that law was not needed. We don't need the Corruption Commission anymore. Although that also tends to be we have a pretty good media spotlight on issues like that. So whenever someone tries to basically erase or take apart the Corruption Commission, they would be like, this particular member of parliament is trying to do this,
And that has mixed results. Sometimes it gets in the back down. Sometimes they just sort of keep saying like, oh, we don't need them anymore, and that kind of thing.
Right. Okay, so kind of selling the idea that we don't need the Corruption Commission, and we're clearly not corrupt. But obviously that's why you need the Corruption Commission in the first place.
Yeah.
You were saying also that the only way that they can recruit anybody to the Corruption Commission is they have to basically take people who have no political interest or any interest in money or basically being not very safe for the next however many years they work for the Corruption Commission. So basically, scholars is the only people they can really take, because anybody who's signed up to a political party is okay, no, you're automatically disqualified from ever working for this thing because you might have been corrupted to screw with us.
I've got a few questions just about a couple of things about how Indonesian politics works, if that's okay.
And also, very quickly, we've never said anything about the voting systems. If you wanted to talk about single non-transferable vote at some point, but that can wait until after the questions, honestly.
So one of my first questions was going to be on the media in Indonesia. So you've talked about there being a lot of candidates and a lot of choice. Over here in the UK, we've got the BBC, which is sort of a state-owned media, but has a mandate to be politically neutral. Is there any sort of media over there in Indonesia that performs the same function?
Not that I'm aware of.
No, I would say no.
In fact, most of the media conglomerates, the heads of the media conglomerates are actually in a political party or heads of political parties, which is a great conflict of interest.
So have you got sort of a station for each one of the main sort of political contenders? So you've got one that supports the current president and the one that supports the sort of challenger at the moment?
Yeah, so we have, I believe, the mainstream media, the most reputable at the moment is called Metro TV, which is and it is run by one of the chairmen of one of the parties, the National Democratic Party. He's chairman and he also owns the media company. So, but as far as I know, they've known to hold themselves to pretty high standards of journalistic rigor. They are incredibly transparent about their process, and they also generally are unbiased. We also have, but if you are within the opposition party, the opposition candidate, a lot of, so what would you say his
coalition?
Sorry, yeah, not his coalition. I'm sorry, his sort of the TV station that supports him and just sort of becomes his mouthpiece is TV1. I'm not sure what the history in that is. I believe there used to be some other station and then that collapsed and was bought by someone who is in the opposition party, and that just sort of started to become mouthpiece. And so I think TV1 in the 2014 election was the only station that announced that the opposition had won, while the 6 other TV station had said that the polling is done and Jokowi has obviously won and is polling at 50 something %, and then this one station just said no, the Prabowo was winning, he's 10% ahead, and he's polling at 62 and 60%, and then that caused a bit of that was a big story back then, and I think a lot of people just sort of started to tune off. At least a lot of people in my circles tuned off of TV1 because of that one sort of fiasco.
But the problem there, presumably, that you have, similar to certain channels in America, where that kind of fake news with the right group of people reinforces their beliefs, and then they might just start watching that channel now. So while you've chosen not to follow it because you know it's wrong, it can be problematic if there's they get a large following of people who believe that is true, even though it doesn't look like it is.
Yeah, so that is pretty true. It just sort of develops into its own echo chamber, I suppose. But I think another thing that I can also comment is that you can see it very, very obvious in how the attitude towards these journalists from Metro TV and Kompas TV, which is the two reputable channels, the independent sort of centrist news channels, is that whenever the opposition party has a rally, they would sort of, I don't know, there has been cases where they would sort of harass the journalists from from Metro TV, those who are like independent, and they would sort of just usually it's just verbal abuse and just sort of the what do you call it, the campaign managers, and then the campaign staff would just sort of stand and like, no, you can't get in. But also a lot of the supporters who just supposedly the candidate can't account for his supporters, because like what his supporters does, he's not responsible for. But a lot of supporters would go, take it a further step and just either literally physically remove these journalists from those rallies by force, or there has been a case where one journalist was, I think she was yelled at and she was surrounded, and I think she may have been physically hurt, although I don't know how bad, but yeah. And then they just like, we don't want journalists from channels X, Y, and Z. If you come here, we will remove you. We don't trust you. We hate you. We don't want you here, basically. And they hold it up in very big banners at like the start of the rally, and just sort of like, we don't want you here. Get away from us. If you try to approach us, we'll try to hurt you, was basically the message that they're trying to like send.
Okay, so we have seen some issues like that with Trump in America, where there have been like there have been various journalists removed in certain ways, but I don't think it's quite the same. That seems very different, having a big sign up, like essentially stating your intentions in advance. That's definitely, in fairness, a political rally seems pretty weird to us as Brits anyway. We don't really gather in large amounts in places very often. But yeah, it seems that does seem slightly concerning going forwards.
Thinking about it now, it's also maybe a little perversely a little bit the same sort of Javanese politeness that got Ahok in trouble because he didn't have it. It's like, we will warn you in advance, don't approach us, because we're trying to be polite about we're probably going to hurt you.
So with that attitude to sort of the mainstream media, how has social media played into the more recent campaigns? Have you seen the same sort of echo chambers and fake news problems that we're seeing around the world?
Wow. Yeah, that it's incredibly disturbing, the amount of things I see go on like Twitter and Instagram, and yeah, it's pretty horrible. So there's obviously these fake news channels and accounts, so to say, and they would say the usual things. They follow a pretty standard operating procedure of just making their news sound convincing and make it seem like it comes from like a mainstream media source, and then sort of push that out, and people would just sort of go crazy. One of the big things is, I think John Oliver did an episode on this where he talked about like the problems that Facebook has in third world countries, where they would sort of be used as a platform to communicate. We have that exact problem here. Another problem we have is our WhatsApp groups. So our WhatsApp groups is usually where like alumni of certain if you're an alumni of a certain class, you have a WhatsApp group where you all just gather and say hi every now and then. The same thing with family WhatsApp groups, and that's the biggest source of fake news, would just be these long paragraphs of unsourced. It's entirely perhaps to you and me it looks completely disreputable, like, oh, no sort of news source would use all caps and like 3 paragraphs long. But to a lot of these people, the problem is that they can't tell the difference between what is fake news, even if it is so thinly veiled that to us we just sort of laugh at it and be like, "Oh, look at that! This like article is so like pathetic," and like I never take that seriously. But in a lot of the more rural areas where they don't necessarily have access to television, but they do have perhaps a computer or a smartphone in their house. That's how they mainly get their news. And so these WhatsApp groups have been pretty instrumental in a lot of, I guess, for these people who are trying to spread fake news, that's their primary means of communication and basically spreading it out. Although the Indonesian government is trying to sort of like intervene and ban accounts, but the problem is you can't look into the WhatsApp groups and the Facebook groups of thousands and thousands of people. And even if you can, you still need permission from the WhatsApp company to have these things removed. And usually these companies like Facebook, WhatsApp, sometimes they do not want to remove these accounts just because they're trying to protect, the discourse that happens online. So it's a very murky field and it's very difficult to navigate.
Yeah, I mean, the benefit of WhatsApp, and I think the idea that WhatsApp messages are end-to-end encrypted and so on is a good thing. And I know that there are I know the government's talking about like putting in backdoors and stuff across the world, and it's like, A, that's not how encryption works, and B, it puts it down a slippery slope. Like, at least we know what WhatsApp is. If you start saying, oh, well, we're going to look at WhatsApp, well, yes, all you do is you end up with some surveillance on the individuals who are generally trustworthy, who are just using WhatsApp, and the kind of people who are using WhatsApp as bad actors tend to be the kind of people who would also go underground and use something else if there was a real problem. I'll get off my encryption-based soapbox. We had a question from the chat, which I suppose we'll just throw it in now. Just wondering if a colleague who's an Indonesian citizen, can they vote while abroad via proxy in a similar way to we can in the UK?
So what I believe my friends who live abroad would do, I just posted an article about fake news, by the way. So yeah. So they would get what's called an A5 document, which says that you can appoint someone to vote on your behalf. But I believe one of the problems with this document is very, very difficult to get a hold of. So the other thing that you can do is, if you live near to an Indonesian embassy or an Indonesian consulate, you would go to the consulate, and then the election commission would have set up station there several days in advance of the election. So I think that's the one part of the election where you are allowed to vote several days ahead of the April 17th date. So I have a lot of friends who live in the UK, and they would travel basically from all around these different universities. They will all travel to the Indonesian embassy in London. And I believe there was like a line that was about like 2 miles long just to get into. So voting by proxy is sort of difficult. Even in Indonesia, if you are hospitalized and you are stuck in a hospital and you can't get out of the hospital bed, the election commission will literally bring the ballot box into the hospital to you so that you can vote.
That's amazing.
Basically, yeah.
That's dedication to democracy in a way. Like, I mean, I know a lot of people who, for whatever reason, weren't able to vote on the day of the election. They just go, oh, shrug, in the UK, which I think is part of the problem. When you've had democracy for a long time, you don't value it as much as you probably should. Yeah, I mean, like, I had to jump through several hoops to do an emergency vote when I suddenly got sent to Manchester on the last day of my vote, on the day of our vote, because I had to get a friend who was driving by to vote by proxy for me. But yeah, wow, that is above and beyond what we do in this country to get people voting.
And it still sometimes doesn't work. We have a friend who he tried to register early because he lives on his polling station where it's supposed to be is like out on an island in the west, and he tried to register a month in advance for like, I'm going to be in Jakarta for the duration. I'm not going to take a plane to my hometown for one day and then come immediately back for this voting. And either they didn't process it in time or they never got it at all, and he didn't get to vote. He was sort of disenfranchised in that sense that the paperwork didn't get through. And you can look up on the internet, are you registered? And he wasn't. So that stunk for him. Actually, Daniel, you had to go for one day. The difference here is that his hometown's on the same island, so he just had to go overnight, stay overnight at your house, I think, and then vote, and then come immediately back, and then go back to work the next day.
Yeah, and luckily it's also kind of smushed in with the long weekend that comes over on Good Friday, so I did have a couple of days off, but I do know people who, so we're voting Wednesday morning from 7 till 1, and so immediately after they get off at work at around 4, 5, or 6 on Tuesday, they would get on a plane and to fly to several of the other islands. It would take 4-hour flights or like 3-hour flights to get back to their hometown just to vote. I know people, I know stories of people who, they take a flight and then they go, 10 hours by car and then 4 hours by boat just to get to the place where they are registered to vote. And it's pretty intense, and basically there's a lot of travel that goes around during this voting week.
And a lot of the reason that you'd have to go all the way back to your hometown, just because like you're working in Jakarta or you're working in another city. Java has the most population of any island. It's more than half the population of the entire country, partly because of all the economic migrants. And part of the reason that you have to go all the way back for that is that the paperwork just to change where you're voting is miserable. The paperwork to do anything in this country, apparently, to do business, to change your voting place, to get a new, we have national ID cards. That was a problem where there was a corruption scandal with that, so the paperwork for that was miserable in that there was just no funds because they were being embezzled, apparently, is absolutely horrendous. So it's easier just to take the plane than to try to get the government to fix it.
Yeah, that's impressive. It's interesting seeing these kind of differences. So, like, on the one hand, someone will bring a ballot box to you so you can personally vote because you're in a hospital, and on the other side,
where the hospitals are.
Yeah, but on the other side, a thing that we have that is a very simple electronic form where you can just fill out to vote with your local council generally. I think our postal vote form has to be done on paper. I think that's the only one that's not digital at the moment. But registering to vote is, while people complain about, like, we should just automatically register everyone to vote, etc., it is pretty easy to register to vote as a general rule in the UK, because we just go to gov.uk and it will take you to the right place and you sign up.
I think the only other one I had, it's going back a bit to our conversation earlier about the ideological positions of the two major parties, if I can call them that, both the incumbent and the challenger.
Coalitions, yes, but yeah.
Yeah. So you've said that the main sort of schism in the politics of Indonesia is the sort of religious aspect between more conservative Islam and, I think, the idea that, I know that Indonesia doesn't have an official state religion. It's a melting pot of, lots of different cultures and ideas. Is this resistance against that sort of multiculturalism a recent thing? Has that happened within the last 10 years? Or is that something that's always been in place in the country's history since 1945?
Yeah, I would say so. So, I believe... So the story goes, I first heard it as an anecdote, but I'm pretty sure this is actually recorded in history, is that when we originally published the Pancasila, the guidelines for our democracy, it says belief in one God, but it used to say belief in Allah, the one and only God, and that Muhammad is his one and only prophet, and Muhammad is his prophet. So it used to be at the genesis of our country. It used to be that they wanted that to be the aspect of the government to sort of be, the official. We will tolerate other religions, but the official religion of the state will be Islam. And then so that's the movement that initially began, and But the problem is, back then, there was still, Islam is also relatively young, at least back then. So young, and not that it's been here a short time, but it's just that it did not know how to mobilize politically. So when the new order started in 1965, the one I told you, where we had I'm just going to say a dictator, what happened was he would try to stamp out any movements that were highly religious. So there has been a lot of, throughout from 65 to 98, there has been separatist movements who are Muslim, and the military sort of really tore them apart. There has been Muslim protests as well. A big one, I think, was in Jakarta, somewhere in the 60s or the 70s, where the protest was, I believe, was just young Muslims from universities and also the more rural regions. They gathered in the capital, and I believe the military surrounded them, tried to push them out of the city, and at the last point, they did shoot into the crowd, and I believe somewhere a dozen or between 10 or 20 people died during that protest. So I think after that, what happened was that the Muslim population sort of, it was still strong. They strongly believe, but now they just, it instilled a fear into them that, like, I believe in Islam, but if I tried to be more militant or more conservative about it, we would be attacked. So when the Reformation period, when the dictatorship, when the dictator resigned his power and it returned to the, I'm using air quotes here, the people, a lot of these organizations, these groups, these conservative Muslim groups, sort of saw this as their opportunity. Like, oh, we've spent the last 30 years in the shadows. Now is our time to push for our agenda. And I suppose in the early 2000s, it was mostly harmless. They again, harmless is relative, but they would say things like, they would push out agendas like bans against drinking, bans against homosexual practices, bans against people who were not family and not married living under one household. Was sort of, they tried to push that type of agenda out. But Indonesia being a mostly conservative country, people did not see that as a very shocking thing. So they sort of went under the radar. These reforms mostly failed. Like the agenda that they tried to push out still mostly failed. Like the ban against alcohol did not go through, or like the ban against men and women who are not married or not family members living under the same house. I don't think that succeeded. So, but what would happen was more and more of these Muslim groups would be disillusioned by the politics, and they would be more and more marginalized, more and more pushed to the fringes, until finally, with the rise of things like social media that gave more of a voice to the people who have usually been in the fringe, they now had a platform, and so they started to gain more strength. And I think that came to a head in, you guys talked about in the last election, with the elections for Ahok, the governor of the Jakarta special region, where there was a doctored video, and a lot of conservative Muslim rights groups would just say, this is it, this is the last straw, we're going to go and march on the capital, and we're going to make our intentions known. And they used that doctored video and other trends, such as more Christians in the government, more non-Muslims basically participating in the government. They would say like, oh, this is our time, look at all the people who are now involved in government, they are not Muslim, this means that our belief is endangered and we need to take that back. And so it just started to sort of gain ground, because terrorism has always been a problem here, but that we never saw the connection between fringe Muslim groups and the political ongoings, the mainstream political occurrences of this country. There's always been sort of like that sort of dichotomy between those two. Like, oh, we have a terrorism problem, but it hasn't penetrated into our institutions. That changed in 2016 and 2017 when they just sort of went out of the shadows and said, like, we had enough of this and we're going to make our voices known whether you like it or not. And because after the Reformation we have this obligation to sort of, we don't want to go back to the dictatorship where the people's voices will be stamped out. They said that even though we don't like the message, freedom of speech says they can still say it. So trying to sort of reduce the amount of Muslim far right groups, both in the physical world and also on the cyber world, has been very, very difficult. Sorry if I got into the rant there.
No, that's great. Thank you for that context. I was just saying thank you for that context. It's really interesting, and I feel like I come out understanding a lot more now.
You mentioned disillusion there. I think that is true of a lot of the politics we're seeing right now, is that there are, we also mentioned silent majorities earlier, there are definitely groups of people who've been disillusioned all across the world for various reasons, and feel like their voice hasn't been heard. And we're seeing some of the effects of that in the politics in every country at the moment, by the looks of it. It's an interesting point to make, and you kind of, it is easy to assume when you're in a bubble, especially if you're in like a liberal university bubble like Rob and I are, that everyone thinks the same as you, and that's not the case. So it's not surprising when suddenly something throws you for a loop, as Brexit did in the UK and Trump did in the US. So I think that all kind of ties back with, and the social media, all of these. So the fact that social media gives people a voice is a good thing. But there are also problems with, like, as we say, fake news and all this going around, and it seems to be affecting, it's a worldwide phenomenon. It's very easy to watch the Western media and go, oh, it's just the UK, it's just the US. But that's not true. And I think I'll try and find it for the show notes. There's a very good podcast episode talking about kind of expounding on what John Oliver said about the problems with Facebook in certain countries where, and part of the problem was that they just didn't have enough local translators who could read and determine if something was a problem or not. So you'd have English people reading and going, oh, well, that looks fine, I don't understand it. Like, well, that's not a suitable solution to the problem.
We don't mind at all. Although, I would like to say before we sort of wrap up our discussion on Indonesia, a friend of mine works in also a podcasting sort of, it's a political consultant company, and they finance a podcast. It's called Indonesia in Depth, and I shall just give you the link over here. And they do conversations with a lot of people from everywhere in the political spectrum and everywhere in the political process. So it's a pretty comprehensive look, and they have a podcast. So if you guys are interested, you can check it out.
No, I mean, that's perfect. We're always happy for our guests to plug their own things, so we'll throw that in the show notes for you. Okay, so we're going to move on to a quick polls update. Rob, have you seen the polls recently? There's been some stories, which I'm sure you haven't missed. So the big news, I think, is that there's now Nigel Farage's Brexit party, because we've got the upcoming MEP elections. Do you have any thoughts on that, Rob?
It's a really interesting move by Nigel Farage, who essentially has disowned UKIP for the reason that it's gone too far right, essentially. I think Nigel believes that the best way to do politics or to abstain Brexit is not through the far right, sort of more racist way. I mean, that might be quite strong, but UKIP have now become the new BNP. Nigel has decided, no, I'm going to set up more of a moderate party, so the Conservatives who used to vote UKIP in the past will come and vote for my new party here. I'm having a real difficulty loading the actual polls website. It's just spinning and spinning. Let me just check if it's my...
Okay, well, while you're loading that, I think I'll give people an overview of what we have got here. So we were talking last time about how it seemed like the time was finally up for the Conservatives. They'd somehow managed to keep this 10-point lead over Labour, and then they'd started to fall. Well, if you look at the averages, we now have Labour above the Conservatives again, and there's a rise in UKIP. But also some of the polls have started to include the Brexit Party. And I don't think that this should be particularly surprising to those of us who've previously talked about how many people moved from UKIP back and forth during the general election and so on. So since there was a Comres poll on the 7th of April, which was a tie, since then, all of the polls have been for Labour, in a range of +1 Labour to +10, which again, we said the kind of +10s seem a bit crazy to us, but it's just been Labour since the start of April, basically. And then if you look at the latest YouGov poll, 12% of people voting for the Brexit Party, according to that poll, and Labour only just above the Conservatives. But in the other ones, it seems like a lot of that Conservative vote and some of the UKIP vote has turned over to this new Brexit Party. And so actually we're kind of seeing a split on the right again. And at the moment, Labour is holding its own as a kind of chunk. So, it's kind of what we were been kind of alluding to in the past, that if something went wrong with Brexit, the UKIPers would leave the Conservatives, and we would end up with Labour in the lead again.
And I think it shows as well the power of one man and the sort of cult of personality figure that's been built around Nigel Farage as a figure. I don't think you could set up this party without him, and I don't think it would have attracted as many votes as it would, or at least the interest in the polls that it has without him. He's sort of been able to, he was able to build UKIP up, and by leaving them and creating his new one, he's been able to, smash them back down again. So that's the interesting thing there. I think the other thing, looking at the polling amongst the pro-Remain groups, people like the Lib Dems, Greens, Change, they're all sort of split too much to put a big dent in anything. And with Labour's current stance on Brexit sort of being nobody's really quite sure what they stand for yet. I mean, it could go one of two ways, couldn't it? It's all dependent, I think, on the talks that they have with Theresa May. But there are mixed messages coming from Labour, and until we know exactly what they're going to do, I don't think we're going to see a significant change in either the Lib Dem or Change vote share until that happens. But yeah, I think Change would be expecting a little bit more. I think Change would, in a perfect world, be hoping that they could match a Brexit Party, and maybe it would be more accurate to merge the polling figures for Change and the Lib Dems. If you do that, then they're pretty much on par with the Brexit Party. So you've got this sort of, I want to say, hardcore 14% of people who really want to leave the EU, who are very Brexity, and you've got a hardcore 14% of parties on the Remain side, and then the rest are sort of in the middle, wondering how to do a Brexit and how hard or soft that Brexit may be.
As inevitably happens when people who don't know how to internet try and do something on the internet. Someone didn't register the brexitparty.com, so someone else went and registered the brexitparty.com as a Stop Farage website. So that's very amusing. I'll put that in the show notes. And it's also talking about registering to vote by May the 7th. So yeah, so you have just over a little over 2 weeks to register to vote for the MEP elections. This is kind of being touted as referendum 2 in a lot of ways, because it will show how many people kind of actually care about the process in Europe. And also, if the Brexit Party does really well, then they can point to that and say, well, look, loads of people still want Brexit because they voted all these Brexit MEPs in. So I think there's definitely, if you want to try and change where things are going, it's a good time to go and register to vote. I mean, I would always recommend you register to vote, but if you haven't, that's your deadline, May 7th. And we'll leave that up to our listeners to go and do. So yes, just mention that there. So thank you all for joining me. So thank you, Rob, as always, for being there and coming in with some astute questions. And thank you to both Daniel and Ev for joining us all the way from Indonesia. That was very interesting and ties into our bonus episode we had before. Is there anything you want to plug?
No, we're good. That's about it.
Okay, perfect. So yes, if as always, you can find Unparliamentary Language on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. You can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at Unparl Podcast. And you can find us on our website, parliamentary.observer, where you'll find the latest episodes and the show notes. And you can come along and comment on there. Comment anywhere. We want your feedback. It's always great. We hope you enjoyed this slightly different episode, having a look into something a bit broader than just the UK and occasional US politics we cover. Also, just a quick self-plug for myself. I am running the marathon in 8 days. The London Marathon in 8 days. That's the 28th of April. So I need to raise £2,000. I'm raising it for Teenage Cancer Trust because cancer sucks, and having cancer as a teenager is even worse. And obviously, it really affects the families. So it's there to support families. It's there to support obviously the children who have cancer, but also it's to help support their families, give them some time off, provide them with extra nursing support, that kind of thing. I'm trying to raise £2,000 for that. Currently approaching 900. I've got a bit of a time to gather all that money, but yes, if there's anything you can donate, please come along to the link that will be in the show notes and throw some money my way. I'm running a silly distance. I think I can do it. I've done it. I've done a marathon before, but I'm not sure how fast I'm going to do this one, but I'm going to make it round. So come and throw some money my way, please. It's for people with cancer, which is obviously awful, and we can support them. If we can support them in any way we can, that's great. And I suppose that's one more thing: patreon.com/TTSS, where you can go and sponsor all of our podcasts and help with, we've improved our recording situation with mics and stuff, but also, funding better software or funding the website a bit is always helpful. So if you can throw some money our way, but if you have a choice between that and supporting kids with cancer, definitely give it to the kids with cancer, please. That would be my choice. So please do that if you're thinking of giving some money and you only have the one or the other. Definitely donate to the marathon run instead. And so I think all that remains to be said is it's goodbye from me,
and it's goodbye from him. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. One quick thing to mention, Lord Buckethead is currently seeking money to get a deposit to run as an MEP against Nigel Farage. He's the hero we need, even though he's from outer space.
Oh goodness, I hope he wins. I really do.
I would love him to go to the European Parliament all the time dressed like that. It's amazing. Yes, sorry, so you were saying... So